Okay, in a world where heroes are expected to look a certain way, sometimes the most powerful weapon against evil comes from the most unexpected source. What happens when a grandmother's knitting needles are replaced by a sniper rifle, and 8 dangerous criminals discover that their biggest mistake was underestimating the quiet woman next door? The morning sun cast long shadows across the quiet suburban street of Millbrook Lane, where Martha Henderson had lived for 37 years. At 62, she moved through her daily routine with the precision of someone who had found comfort in predictability. Her neighbors knew her as the woman who always had fresh cookies ready for the mailman, who kept the most beautiful rose garden on the block, and who never missed Sunday service at St. Matthew's Episcopal Church.
What they didn't know was that Martha Henderson could place a bullet through a dime at 800 yards. The irony wasn't lost on Martha as she adjusted the lace curtains in her kitchen window, watching Mrs.
Patterson from across the street struggle with her garbage bins. Everyone saw what they expected to see: a soft-spoken widow who spent her days tending to her garden and her evenings crocheting blankets for the church charity drive. The truth was far more complex, buried beneath layers of carefully constructed normalcy that had taken decades to perfect. Martha's transformation into the neighborhood's beloved grandmother figure hadn't happened overnight. It began 25 years earlier when she left her position as a decorated Army sniper, one of the first women to serve in that capacity during the Gulf War. The transition from military precision to civilian life had been jarring, but Martha had thrown herself into it with the same dedication she'd once reserved for her service. She learned to bake, took up gardening, and slowly built relationships with neighbors who saw only what she allowed them to see. The weight of her hidden past pressed against her consciousness every day, like wearing an invisible uniform beneath her floral house dresses. In her bedroom closet behind boxes of Christmas decorations and old photo albums, a specially designed case held her custom rifle, a modified Remington 700 that had been her faithful companion through 3 tours of duty. She maintained it religiously, though she hadn't fired it in anger for over 2 decades. The morning of October 15th started like any other. Martha had risen at 5:30 a.m., made her coffee, and settled into her favorite chair by the front window to read the newspaper. The routine was sacred to her. It provided structure in a world that had once been defined by military precision and life-or-death decisions. As she turned the pages scanning articles about local politics and community events, she had no idea that within hours, every skill she'd spent decades trying to forget would become the only thing standing between her neighbors and unthinkable tragedy. The first sign something was wrong came at 11:47 a.m. when Martha noticed an unfamiliar van parked at the end of the street. Her trained eye immediately cataloged the details: dark blue Ford Transit, tinted windows, license plate partially obscured by mud. The vehicle itself wasn't unusual, but its positioning was. It had a clear line of sight to the elementary school 3 blocks away, and the driver seemed to be studying the neighborhood rather than looking for a specific address. Martha's instincts, honed by years of military service, began to whisper warnings. She moved to her kitchen window for a different angle and noticed a second vehicle, a black SUV, parked behind the community center. Again, the positioning seemed deliberate, strategic rather than random. Her pulse quickened, but she forced herself to remain calm. 25 years of civilian life had taught her that sometimes suspicious behavior had innocent explanations. But when she spotted the third vehicle, her blood went cold. The gray sedan had positioned itself near the entrance to Millbrook Lane, effectively blocking the main route in and out of the neighborhood. The pattern was unmistakable to anyone with tactical training. They were setting up a perimeter. Martha's hands trembled slightly as she reached for the binoculars she kept on the kitchen counter, ostensibly for birdwatching, but actually military-grade Steiner optics that could reveal details most civilians would miss. Through the magnified lenses, her worst fears were confirmed. The men in the vehicles were armed. She could see the distinctive outline of assault weapons through the van's partially open door, and the way the occupants moved spoke of military or paramilitary training. This wasn't a random crime in progress, it was a coordinated operation. Martha's mind raced through possibilities. The neighborhood was home to several high-profile residents. A federal judge lived 4 houses down. A prominent businessman who'd recently testified in a major corruption case lived around the corner, and there were rumors that a witness in an organized crime trial had been relocated to the area under federal protection. Any one of them could be the target, but the positioning of the vehicles suggested something larger in scope. As she watched, a 4th vehicle appeared, another SUV that took position near the playground where several children were playing under their mother's supervision. Martha's maternal instincts, developed through years of caring for neighborhood children and her own grandchildren who lived across the country, flared to life. Whatever these men were planning, Innocent people were going to be caught in the crossfire. The military tactician that lived beneath Martha's carefully constructed persona began to assert itself. She analyzed the terrain, identified potential fields of fire, and assessed the enemy's capabilities based on their positioning and visible equipment. Her civilian neighbors continued their daily routines, completely unaware that their quiet street had become a battlefield waiting to happen. Martha knew she had three choices: call the police and hope they arrived in time, evacuate herself and leave her neighbors to their fate, or dust off skills she'd spent 25 years trying to forget. The first option was logical but potentially too slow. By the time law enforcement mobilized and responded, whatever was planned could already be over. The second option went against every instinct she'd developed both as a soldier and as a member of this community. That left the third option. Moving with purpose she hadn't felt in decades, Martha climbed the stairs to her bedroom. Her hand shook slightly as she moved the Christmas decoration boxes aside and entered the combination on the case that held her rifle. The weapon looked exactly as she'd left it after her last maintenance session 6 months earlier. Cleaned, oiled, and ready for action she'd hoped would never come. As she assembled the rifle with movements made automatic by thousands of repetitions, Martha caught sight of herself in the bedroom mirror. The woman staring back at her was a strange hybrid. Grandmother's face and clothing, but holding a weapon with the confidence of someone who'd once been considered one of the Army's most elite marksmen. The contradiction should have been jarring, but instead it felt like pieces of herself finally clicking back into place. From her upstairs bathroom window, Martha had a commanding view of the entire neighborhood. She could see all four vehicles and had clear shooting lanes to each position, and deciding whether. More importantly, she could see that the men were beginning to move with increased urgency. Whatever timeline they were operating on, the operation was about to begin. Through her scope, Martha watched as armed figures emerged from the vehicles. 8 men total, all carrying assault weapons and moving with military precision. They were dressed in civilian clothing, but their coordination spoke of extensive training. As they began to advance on their targets, Martha realized with growing horror that they weren't focused on a single house. They were targeting the entire neighborhood. The lead team moved toward Judge Morrison's house, while a second group headed for the businessman's residence. A third pair took position near the playground, and the final two seemed to be establishing overwatch positions that would allow them to control the entire area. This wasn't an assassination. It was a massacre designed to look like a coordinated terrorist attack. Martha's finger found the familiar curve of her rifle's trigger as she settled into a shooting position she'd assumed countless times in her military career. The muscle memory was perfect, her breathing automatically adjusting to the rhythm that would allow for precision shooting. Through her scope, she could see Mrs. Patterson still struggling with her garbage bins, completely unaware that armed men were approaching her neighbor's house. The distance to the nearest target was approximately 150 yards, an easy shot for someone of Martha's capabilities. But taking that shot would announce her presence and turn her into a target as well. Once she fired, there would be no going back to her quiet life as the neighborhood's beloved grandmother. Everything she'd built over 25 years would be destroyed in an instant. But as she watched one of the gunmen raise his weapon toward Judge Morrison's front door, Martha realized that some things were more important than maintaining a cover identity. Some things were worth sacrificing everything to protect. Her finger tightened on the trigger as she whispered a prayer she'd learned in the foxholes of Iraq. God grant me steady hands and true aim. The transformation from Martha Henderson, neighborhood grandmother, to Sergeant First Class Martha Chen, United States Army sniper, was complete. The war had come to Millbrook Lane, and the only thing standing between 8 armed killers and innocent civilians was a 62-year-old woman who'd spent decades convincing everyone that she was nothing more than someone who baked excellent cookies and grew prize-winning roses. As the first gunman reached Judge Morrison's porch, Martha took a deep breath and prepared to remind the world why she'd once been considered one of the most dangerous women in the United States military. The quiet suburban morning was about to become very loud indeed. The first shot rang out at exactly 12:03 p.m., shattering the peaceful silence of Millbrook Lane like thunder in a clear sky. The gunman who had been reaching for Judge Morrison's doorbell dropped instantly, his assault rifle clattering across the concrete porch. The sound echoed through the neighborhood, causing dogs to bark and sending Mrs. Patterson diving behind her garbage bins in terror. Martha didn't pause to appreciate her marksmanship. The moment her bullet found its target, she was already acquiring the second threat. Through her scope, she watched the remaining 7 attackers react with the disciplined confusion of trained soldiers suddenly finding themselves under fire from an unknown position. They immediately sought cover,
scanning rooftops and windows for the source of the shot that had dropped their teammate. The element of surprise was Martha's greatest advantage, but it wouldn't last long. These men weren't common criminals caught off guard by unexpected resistance. They were professionals who would quickly adapt to the new threat. She had perhaps 30 seconds before they located her position and began returning fire. Her second target was the gunman approaching the playground where 3 young children had been playing under their mother's watchful eye. The mother, Sarah Chen, no relation, despite sharing Martha's maiden name, had grabbed her children at the sound of the first gunshot and was trying to shepherd them toward the safety of the community center. But the gunman was moving to intercept them, his weapon raised and ready. Martha's crosshairs settled on the man's center mass. At 200 yards, with a slight crosswind, she made minute adjustments that were as natural as breathing. The second shot was as precise as the first, dropping the attacker before he could reach the terrified family. The Sarah Chen looked around wildly, unable to understand where the shots were coming from, but smart enough to continue moving her children toward cover. 2 down. 6 to go. The remaining attackers had begun to triangulate her position. Martha could see them communicating through hand signals, dividing into teams to approach her house from multiple angles.
They'd identified her general location but not her exact position, which gave her a few more precious seconds. Her third target was moving along the side of the community center, using the building as cover while trying to get an angle on her bathroom window.
Through her scope, Martha could see he was carrying not just an assault rifle but also what appeared to be an explosive device strapped to his vest. The implications sent a chill down her spine. These men hadn't come just to kill specific targets. They'd come to destroy the entire neighborhood. The shot was more challenging, requiring her to lead the moving target while accounting for the angle and distance. Martha's training took over completely, her body settling into the familiar rhythm of combat shooting. Breathe in, exhale halfway, hold, squeeze the trigger with the steady pressure of a gentle handshake. The bullet found its mark, and the bomber collapsed against the community center wall.
3 down. 5 remaining.
The sound of breaking glass from downstairs told Martha that her position had been compromised. At least one of the attackers had reached her house and was attempting to breach from the ground floor.
She could hear heavy footsteps on her hardwood floors, moving with the careful precision of someone trained in urban combat. Martha faced a terrible choice. She could maintain her overwatch position and continue engaging the external threats, but that would leave her vulnerable to the gunmen now inside her home. Alternatively, she could abandon her sniper's nest to deal with the immediate threat, but that would leave the remaining attackers free to continue their assault on her neighbors.
The decision was made for her when she heard Mrs. Patterson screaming from across the street.
Through her peripheral vision, Martha could see that 2 of the remaining gunmen had cornered the elderly woman behind her garbage bins. Patterson was in her 70s, suffered from arthritis, and couldn't possibly escape on her own. If Martha didn't act immediately, her neighbor would become the first civilian casualty. Ignoring the sounds of the intruder searching her house below, Martha swung her rifle toward the new threat. The angle was difficult. She had to shoot between houses and over Mrs. Patterson's head to reach the attackers. The margin for error was virtually non-existent. A shot that was off by even inches could hit the woman she was trying to save. Martha's hands were absolutely steady as she lined up the shot. This was the kind of precision shooting that separated elite snipers from ordinary marksmen, the ability to make impossible shots under extreme pressure while innocent lives hung in the balance. She controlled her breathing, calculated the ballistics in a fraction of a second, and squeezed the trigger. The first gunman fell immediately. His partner, startled by seeing his teammate drop without warning, made the fatal mistake of standing up to look for the sniper. Martha's follow-up shot was equally precise, dropping him beside his fallen comrade. Mrs. Patterson, though terrified and confused, was safe. 5 down, 3 to go. The footsteps on Martha's staircase were getting closer. She could hear her intruder moving methodically through her home, clearing each room with professional thoroughness. He would reach her position within minutes, and once he did, her elevated advantage would become a deadly trap. But before she could address the immediate threat, Martha spotted something that made her blood freeze. The remaining 2 external attackers had regrouped near Judge Morrison's house, and one of them was setting up what appeared to be a rocket-propelled grenade launcher. The target wasn't just the judge's house. The angle suggested they were aiming at the elementary school 3 blocks away. Through her scope, Martha could see children visible in the school's windows. The building's afternoon recess was starting, which meant hundreds of young students would soon be in the courtyard. A single RPG round could kill dozens of children and teachers. Martha had perhaps 10 seconds to make a shot that was borderline impossible. The distance was over 400 yards. The target was partially concealed behind a car, and the wind had picked up significantly. Worse, She could hear her home invader had reached the second floor and was moving down the hallway toward her bathroom. Everything Martha had learned in 25 years of military service condensed into this single moment. She blocked out the approaching footsteps, the screaming from outside, and the chaos erupting throughout her neighborhood. The world narrowed to the precise circle of her scope's reticle and the man preparing to murder children. The shot was perfect. The gunman with the RPG launcher dropped instantly, his weapon clattering harmlessly to the ground. But Martha's relief was short-lived. The final external attacker, enraged by seeing his entire team systematically eliminated, began spraying automatic fire in the direction of Martha's house. Bullets shattered windows and punched through walls, sending splinters of wood and drywall flying through the air. At that same moment, Martha's bathroom door exploded inward as the intruder finally located her position. He was a large man, heavily armed and wearing tactical gear that marked him as the team's point man. His eyes widened in shock when he saw not the tactical operator he'd expected, but a 62-year-old woman in a floral house dress holding a sniper rifle with the confidence of a trained killer. The surprise gave Martha the split second she needed. Still lying in her shooting position, she pivoted the rifle toward the doorway and fired from the hip, a technique she'd learned in close-quarters combat training but never thought she'd need to use in her own bathroom. The shot caught the intruder's center mass, dropping him before he could bring his assault rifle to bear. 6 down. 2 to go. But Martha's situation had become desperate. The final external attacker was now focusing all his fire on her house, and the structure was taking severe damage. Bullets were punching through walls with terrifying regularity, and Martha could see that several had passed close enough to her position that she could feel the wind displacement. Worse, she could hear sirens in the distance, which meant police were finally responding. But they would be arriving into an active firefight, and without knowledge of Martha's position, they might mistake her for one of the attackers. She needed to end this situation before law enforcement arrived and complicated matters further. Moving with the fluid grace of someone half her age, Martha abandoned her bathroom sniper's nest and made her way to her bedroom window, which offered a different angle on the remaining threat. The gunman had taken cover behind a car but was reloading his weapon, a process that would take several seconds and leave him briefly vulnerable. Through her bedroom window, Martha had a clear shot at the final attacker. But as she lined up her rifle, she noticed something that changed everything. The man wasn't just reloading, he was attaching what appeared to be an incendiary device to his rifle. He wasn't planning to escape or continue the firefight. He was preparing to burn down as many houses as possible before going down. The psychological profile was clear to Martha's trained mind. This was the team leader, the one who'd planned the entire operation. When his mission had failed catastrophically, he'd shifted to a scorched earth mentality. If he couldn't complete his original objective, he would cause as much destruction as possible before being stopped. Martha's final shot had to be perfect, not just accurate enough to stop the threat, but precise enough to prevent him from triggering the incendiary device in his death throes. She needed a clean kill shot that would drop him instantly, with no opportunity for a final spasmodic action that could still set the neighborhood ablaze. The distance was approximately 250 yards, with a moderate crosswind and the target partially concealed behind the vehicle he was using for cover. Martha could see just enough of his upper torso and head to make a killing shot possible, but the margin for error was minimal. The sirens grew louder and the chaos of her destroyed bathroom reminded her that her quiet life was over forever. Martha Henderson took aim at her final target. In her mind, she was no longer the grandmother who baked cookies and tended roses. She was Sergeant First Class Martha Chen, United States Army sniper, and she had a job to finish. The last shot was the most important one of her life. Not just because it would end the immediate threat, but because it would determine whether she could live with herself afterward. In the space between heartbeats, Martha made the decision that would define the rest of her days. She squeezed the trigger one final time. The final bullet left Martha's rifle at 285 feet per second, traveling the 250 yards to its target in less than a third of a second. The shot was perfect, a clean headshot that dropped the team leader instantly before he could trigger the incendiary device. As his body crumpled behind the car, the immediate threat to Millbrook Lane came to an end. But Martha Henderson's transformation from hidden veteran to reluctant hero was just beginning. The silence that followed the final gunshot was almost as deafening as the firefight had been. Martha remained motionless at her bedroom window for several long seconds, her rifle still trained on the spot where the last attacker had fallen. 25 years of civilian life had taught her patience, but 25 years of military training had taught her that threats could emerge from unexpected directions even after a battle seemed over. The sound of approaching sirens grew louder, and Martha realized she needed to make some rapid decisions about how to present herself when law enforcement arrived. Through her scope, she could see police vehicles racing down Millbrook Lane, their emergency lights painting the afternoon shadows in flashing red and blue. In a few minutes, her home would be surrounded by officers who would need to quickly determine whether she was a threat or an ally. Moving with deliberate calm, Martha unloaded her rifle and disassembled it, according to military protocol. Why, she placed the components back in their case and stored it in her closet, then changed from her bullet-torn house dress into a clean outfit that didn't bear the evidence of combat. Looking at herself in the mirror, she practiced the expression of a confused and frightened elderly woman, a performance she knew she'd need to maintain until she could properly explain the situation to authorities. The first police officers to arrive on scene found a neighborhood in chaos. Residents were emerging from their homes where they'd taken shelter, children were crying, and the evidence of a major firefight was scattered across several blocks. The judges said, "Theirs was this. Theirs was this." 8 bodies lay in various positions throughout the area, all carrying military-grade weapons and tactical equipment that suggested a coordinated assault rather than random violence. When officers reached Martha's house, they found her sitting calmly in her kitchen, hands folded in her lap, appearing every inch the traumatized grandmother who'd witnessed something terrible. Her performance was flawless. The slight tremor in her hands could have been from age or shock, and her wide-eyed expression suggested innocence rather than the steely competence of a trained killer. "Ma'am, are you injured?" the first officer through her door asked, noting the bullet holes in her walls and the shattered windows throughout the ground floor. "I'm fine, dear," Martha replied in the soft voice her neighbors had known for decades. "I hid in my basement when the shooting started. I have no idea what happened out there." The officer's partner was examining the extensive damage to Martha's house with growing amazement. "Ma'am, it looks like someone was specifically targeting your home. Do you have any idea why these men might have singled you out?" Martha's mind raced through possible explanations that wouldn't reveal her military background. "I can't imagine. I don't understand why anyone would want to hurt me." As more law enforcement personnel arrived, including FBI agents who'd been monitoring potential terrorist activity in the region, the scope of what had been prevented began to become clear. The 8 attackers had been carrying enough firepower to turn the quiet neighborhood into a war zone, and evidence found in their vehicles suggested they'd been planning to kill not just specific targets but as many civilians as possible. Agent Sarah Morrison, daughter of the federal judge who'd been one of the primary targets, took charge of the scene. Her father's involvement made the case personal, but it also gave her insight into why the attack had been planned. Judge Morrison had been presiding over a major organized crime case, and the defendants apparently decided that eliminating him and creating a terrorist incident would disrupt the proceedings enough to secure their freedom. "The tactical precision of this attack is remarkable," Agent Morrison told her team as they examined the crime scene. 8 trained operators, military-grade weapons, coordinated timing, and multiple escape routes planned. This wasn't the work of amateurs. What puzzled investigators, however, was how the attack had been stopped. The ballistic evidence showed that all 8 attackers had been eliminated by an unknown sniper who'd fired from a concealed position with extraordinary accuracy. The shooting patterns indicated someone with elite military training, but there were no obvious candidates in the neighborhood who fit that profile. Martha listened from her kitchen as investigators discussed their theories outside her windows. They'd correctly identified that a single shooter had been responsible for stopping the attack, and they'd traced the trajectory of several shots to the general area of her house. But none of them suspected that the neighborhood's beloved grandmother could have been capable of such precise combat shooting. As the investigation continued, Martha found herself in an increasingly difficult position. She wanted to help law enforcement understand what had happened, but revealing her military background would raise questions about why she'd concealed it for so long. More troubling, it would destroy the relationships she'd spent decades building with neighbors who'd come to trust her as a harmless elderly woman. The moral complexity of her situation became clear when Agent Morrison knocked on her door 3 hours after the shooting had ended. The young woman's resemblance to her father was unmistakable, and Martha felt an unexpected surge of maternal protectiveness towards someone who'd nearly lost a parent to the attack she'd prevented. "Mrs. Henderson, I'm Agent Morrison with the FBI," the woman said, settling into Martha's kitchen with the professional friendliness that all law enforcement officers learn to project during sensitive interviews. "I know this has been a traumatic day, but I need to ask you some questions about what you observed." Martha poured tea with steady hands while internally preparing for what might be the most important conversation of her civilian life. "Of course, dear. I'll help however I can. Our ballistic analysis shows that several shots were fired from this house," Agent Morrison said, watching Martha's reaction carefully. The angles and precision suggest someone with extensive marksmanship training. Do you have any idea who might have been using your home as a shooting platform? The moment of truth had arrived. Martha could continue her deception and potentially hamper the investigation. Or she could reveal the truth and face the consequences of her decades-long secret. Looking into Agent Morrison's eyes that belonged to someone who'd almost been orphaned that afternoon, Martha made her decision. "Agent Morrison," she said quietly, "there's something I need to tell you about my background." Over the next hour, Martha Henderson revealed herself to be Sergeant First Class Martha Chen, United States Army, retired, holder of the Distinguished Service Cross, and veteran of 3 combat tours during which she'd served as one of the military's first female snipers. She explained her decision to assume a new identity after leaving the service, her desire for a normal civilian life, and her choice to intervene when she'd recognized the tactical pattern of a coordinated attack. Agent Morrison listened with growing amazement as the woman she'd assumed was a typical suburban grandmother revealed herself to be one of the most decorated female veterans in military history. The pieces of the puzzle finally clicked into place. The precision shooting, the tactical awareness, and the ability to remain calm under extreme pressure all made sense once Martha's true background was revealed. "Why didn't you identify yourself immediately?" Agent Morrison asked, though she thought she already knew the answer. "Because I spent 25 years building a life where I didn't have to be a killer," Martha replied simply. "Today's circumstances forced me to remember skills I'd hoped to never use again, but I couldn't stand by and watch innocent people die when I had the ability to stop it." The investigation that followed Martha's revelation moved quickly. The FBI's background check confirmed her military service and security clearances, while ballistic analysis of her rifle matched the evidence found at the scene. More importantly, surveillance footage from traffic cameras had captured the attackers' vehicles arriving and positioning themselves for the assault, corroborating Martha's account of recognizing the tactical pattern before the shooting began. Within 48 hours, Martha Henderson had become a national news story. The image of a grandmother who'd secretly been an elite military sniper captured the public's imagination in ways that surprised everyone involved. News crews descended on Millbrook Lane, seeking interviews with the woman who'd single-handedly stopped a terrorist attack that could have killed dozens of civilians. But the attention came with costs that Martha had anticipated. Her carefully constructed quiet life was shattered beyond repair. Neighbors who'd known her for decades struggled to reconcile the woman who'd baked them cookies with someone capable of eliminating 8 armed attackers in minutes. Some felt betrayed by her deception, while others were simply intimidated by the revelation of her true capabilities. Patterson, whose life Martha had directly saved, became one of her strongest supporters. "I don't care what she did before she moved here," the elderly woman told reporters. "All I know is that when I needed help, Martha Henderson was there for me. She's been a good neighbor for 37 years, and nothing that happened yesterday changes that." The legal aftermath was surprisingly straightforward. Martha's actions were clearly justified self-defense and defense of others, and the evidence of the attacker's intentions was overwhelming. No charges were filed, and the FBI formally commended her actions in preventing what could have been a devastating terrorist incident. Martha found herself struggling with feelings she'd thought she'd left behind decades earlier. The muscle memory of combat had returned so easily that it frightened her, and she wondered if the peaceful woman she'd become had been real or simply another kind of camouflage. 6 months after the shooting, Martha made another life-changing decision. Instead of trying to rebuild her anonymous existence in Millbrook Lane, she accepted a position with the FBI's training academy, teaching marksmanship and tactical awareness to new agents. At 63, she was finally ready to integrate both halves of her identity instead of hiding one behind the other. Agent Morrison, who'd become a friend during the investigation, visited Martha at the academy on her first day of teaching. "Any regrets about giving up your quiet life?" she asked as they watched new recruits struggling with basic shooting exercises. Martha considered the question while adjusting the sights on a trainee's rifle. Around them, young men and women were learning skills they might need to protect innocent people, just as she'd done that October afternoon. The work felt like a natural extension of what she'd accomplished in Millbrook Lane, using her abilities to make others safer rather than hiding those abilities away. "I spent 25 years pretending to be someone I wasn't," Martha finally answered. "It was peaceful, but it wasn't honest. Maybe it's time to find out what happens when I'm both Martha Henderson and Sergeant First Class Chen at the same time." The transformation was complete, but it wasn't the return to her military identity that Martha had feared. Instead, she'd found a way to honor both the woman who'd baked cookies for her neighbors and the soldier who'd protected them when it mattered most.
The quiet suburban street where she'd once hidden had become the place where she'd finally learned to be completely herself. In the end, the day that 8 hackers had learned not to underestimate an elderly grandmother had also taught Martha Henderson that she didn't have to choose between being a warrior and being a neighbor. Sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was simply be ready to protect the people you cared about, regardless of what they expected you to be capable of doing. The woman who'd spent decades convincing everyone she was harmless had discovered that true strength came not from hiding your capabilities, but from using them in service of something greater than yourself. And in a training academy filled with future law enforcement officers, Sergeant First Class Martha Chen had found the perfect place to teach that lesson to the next generation.